Hello, everyone. All right, welcome everyone. Hello. I am so excited to welcome you all here today on this cold New York evening. On behalf of the People's Forum, it's an honor to have you all here, all of you who are filling our space in person and also who have joined us from a distance online. My name is Leanne Fullahan, and I am the Education Director at the People's Forum. And we hope that if this is your first time at the People's Forum, that it's a place that you find you can always return to, that you can always feel welcome, and you can always meet, encounter the comrades, the organizations, and the people's movements who are united in their struggle to build a world for the majority. We are so excited and honored to be hosting our dear friends and comrades at the Progressive International for this very urgent conversation and this exceptional lineup, this exceptional convening of speakers, of the voices who are leading the initiatives to build an alternative to the unipolar US-dominated global system. Global capitalism and US imperialism has taken far too many lives, more than we can count here in this space today, in its quest for endless accumulation of profit. And we know very clearly, all of us know, that this is not this agenda does not represent neither the will, nor the desire, nor the actual plans of the peoples of the world. And so it is urgent for us to build the capacity and start the conversations to build a world of good relations where sovereignty is respected and where the material conditions of the peoples of the world is not only guaranteed, but it's also determined by them. So we need to do this, we need to be reaching across the lines of division that capital has imposed on us, reach across borders, reach across sectors, and have these important conversations and build together for a future for the majority of the people. So for this reason, we are so excited for this urgent conversation. Thank you so much to the organizers, to all the speakers who are here with us today, to our amazing interpreters who are making this possible for us, and for all of you for participating. With that, we'll get the program started, and it's wonderful to have you all here.
We have been here before. Rocketing energy prices rob families of light, heat, and fuel. Droughts and floods drive displacement and famine. Soaring inflation swells the cost of living for our communities and the cost of borrowing for our governments. In short, the international economic order is breaking down, raising the same question today as 50 years ago. What will replace it? Back in the 1970s, the nations of the Third World, having won their independence from colonial powers, came together to answer this question. Confronted with their own series of grave crises, these nations developed a vision of a new international economic order, the NEIO.
La libération politique n'a de contenu que par la libération économique.
Adopted at the United Nations General Assembly in 1974, the NEIO Declaration set out to transform the system of trade, finance, and technology to drive sovereign development across the global south.
Se puede afirmar que las formas depredatorias de la explotación que han mantenido a 3/4 partes de la humanidad en hambre y enfermedad ha llegado a su fin.
But the governments of the North were already plotting its destruction. Against the NEIO's vision of sovereign development, they enforced structural adjustment, privatizing, liberalizing, and financializing the economies of the South. A new order was thus born, but its name was neoliberalism. Today, once again, the world experiences a series of grave crises, economic in origin but existential in nature.
La construcción de un nuevo orden mundial para beneficio de todos los estados es inevitable.
Today, once again, it is leaders in the global south that are developing policies and plans to redress our planetary crises.
And we must ask ourselves, therefore, whether the time has not come for a review of the settlement of the Bretton Woods institutions.
Nos resulta inaceptable este orden mundial arbitrario.
Our challenge is to combine these efforts in a common vision of a new international economic order that corresponds to the needs of people and planet. That is why next month we're going back to New York City on the eve of its 50th anniversary. On 8th December, representatives from around the world will come together to present, deliberate, and develop proposals for a new UN declaration fit for the 21st century. Join us.
50 years ago, this very week, Chilean President Salvador Allende stood about 10 blocks from this podium and told the world about Chile's path out of structural dependency and towards sovereign development. The people of Chile, he said, have won the government after a long road of generous sacrifice. And that government is fully involved in the task of installing economic democracy so that productive activity will operate in response to needs and social expectations and not in the interests of individual profit. But for all that generous sacrifice, the US responded to Allende's victory with what Allende called an invisible blockade to isolate and to undermine the Chilean economy. From the very day of our electoral triumph, he said, we have felt the effects of large-scale external pressure against us, which have tried to prevent the inauguration of a government freely elected by the people and which has tried to bring it down ever since. In a word, he said, it is what we call imperialism. And of course, the General Assembly erupted in cheers of Viva Allende, Viva Allende, Viva Allende. Now, at the time, a young U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, a man by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush, challenged Allende's account. He said in the press conference that followed that the U.S. companies had no intention of blockading Chile and that U.S. simply pursued mutual benefit between the investor and the people of Chile. He said, we don't think of ourselves as imperialists. That was a direct quote. Of course, 2 years later, right here in New York, the General Assembly signed into history the Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order, an incisive vision of technology transfer, regulated food prices, fair development financing, and sovereign development of natural resources. By then, of course, Salvador Allende was dead. The CIA-backed coup in Santiago had settled any lingering doubts about the existence of U.S. imperialism, but his spirit lived on in the NEIO and the powerful coalition of third world nations that brought it to life. Even Henry Kissinger was cowed. Quote, we have to avoid an international dispute where Americans say the existing system is great and the least developed countries call for a new international economic order, Kissinger told President Gerald Ford in a private, since-leaked White House conversation. So tonight we pay homage to Salvador Allende's historic speech by kicking off our own 2-year process of discussion, deliberation, and presentation of a new UN declaration on the NEIO fit for the 21st century. My name is David Adler, General Coordinator of the Progressive International, and it's my honor to welcome so many distinguished guests and dear friends here to the People's Forum in New York City as we chart the path towards the 50th anniversary of the NEIO. Today, of course, we face, as my colleagues said on that video, many of the same crises we faced then. Some would say, in the parlance of today, the same polycrisis. I'm not sure I would say that. The eruption of proxy war, the subsequent energy crunch, the soaring cost of food, severity of sovereign debt, struggle over natural resources, the hoarding of critical technology in the face of things like a viral pandemic swallowing the world. Today, the world is, as it was then, in between orders. Or as our friend in Germany would like to say, we're living through a global Zeitenwende. Back then, though, nations of the South did not wait around for those great powers to reorder the world around them. They fought struggles of national liberation at Bandung, at Cairo, at Accra, at Algiers, and Hanoi. Then they came together as a bloc of nations in Bandung, and Cairo, and Dakar. Then, of course, right here in New York, they built a global vision of the NEIO and won its UN declaration. Today, we begin from the premise that we lack that common vision that motivated the original NEIO 50 years ago. How will we confront the crises of war, climate change, hunger, and poverty that threaten humanity today? People love to talk about multipolarity and the multipolar world to come, as if multipolarity in and of itself guaranteed greater sovereignty, peace, and democracy. But a multipolar world can be one of Cold War and proxy violence, where might makes right and international law means nothing, or a multipolar world can be one in which all peoples and all nations flourish with sovereignty, democracy, and prosperity. So that is our task tonight, our threefold task tonight, and over the next 2 years, to reflect on the history of the NEIO, what made possible this powerful coalition of third world, now global South nations. 2, to renovate that vision for the 21st century. And 3, of course, to make a plan to win it over the course of the coming years. Because that old NEIO failed. We know that much. The commodity boom faltered, sovereignty exploded, and the US won the world back for another half century of unilateral domination. But today, we really can't afford to fail. Renewing the NEIO today is not just a matter of social justice. It is a matter of urgency or of survival. So it's in that spirit of urgency and solidarity and creativity that we convene this process, and with which I pass the microphone to my wonderful co-host, co-moderator, Vasuki Nesia. Vasuki is a professor of practice at NYU Gallatin, faculty director of the Gallatin Global Fellowship in Human Rights, where her research is focused precisely on these questions, these past approaches to the critical questions that we're discussing here tonight. So Vasuki, the floor is yours to help us make sense of this history.
Thanks, David, and thanks to both the People's Forum and to Progressive International. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and really in a very exciting moment, the launch of a new NEIO process. What I would like to do in these opening remarks is to situate the original NEIO in the histories of resistance and solidarity that enabled it. 1974 was a banner year for the United Nations General Assembly, and the passage of the NEIO Declaration was its crowning glory. Many saw the NEIO as laying the foundation for economic self-determination that would ensure that political self-determination was not just a formalist achievement, but a substantive realization that finally turned the chapter on a Eurocentric economic architecture. Within the context of the UN, the NEIO was a radical intervention that epitomized the paradoxical subject position of anti-colonial sovereignty in that moment, seeking inclusion in a world order that they wanted to transform. The NEIO can be situated in three interrelated spaces of struggle: one of social movements and the new consciousness and solidarities that had emerged through anti-colonial resistance. Secondly, the space for global governance and the forceful collective voice of the nation states emerging from decolonization. And thirdly, the renaissance in ideas about alternative economic horizons and how to make the path there that had emerged from institutions such as CEPAL, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America, and later UNCTAD, the UN United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Let me say a few words about each of these spaces. Firstly, the terrain of social movements. Decolonization was, of course, achieved through resistance movements across the world, sometimes united, sometimes fractured, sometimes caught up in Cold War politics, sometimes carrying forth the third path, aligned, we may say, with the non-aligned movement. In the historical moment of the early 70s, two movements of the not yet decolonized were especially noteworthy: the self-determination struggles of the Palestinian people and the anti-apartheid struggles of the South African people. These movements cultivated a collective consciousness and affirmed the possibility of finding collective purpose through the UN. After all, the NEIO was only one of a series of remarkable General Assembly resolutions in 1974. That same year, the General Assembly passed Resolution 3236, which affirmed the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, national independence and sovereignty, and the right of Palestinians to return to their homes and property. Most significantly, it was followed that same day by Resolution 3237, which gave the PLO observer status. South Africa was also suspended from the General Assembly in 1974. From apartheid to settler colonialism, the General Assembly of that period was abuzz with reformist projects, taking on the unfinished work of decolonization processes on multiple fronts. This was the milieu from which the NEIO Declaration emerged in 1974. And this takes me to the third space that was pivotal to birthing the NEIO, and that's a space of ideas and the alternative analysis of global markets and how they functioned that is represented in the NEIO. This analysis was indebted to third world economists such as the Argentinian Raul Prebisch, the first executive secretary of CEPAL. CEPAL was a central incubator for the ideas that informed the NEIO, including dependency theory. Prebisch himself became the first Secretary General of UNCTAD, which expanded beyond Latin America to play a pivotal role as a think tank for what became the NEIO. Similarly, the Sri Lankan economist and diplomat, Dr. Gamini Korea, helped create the Group of 77 at the first UNCTAD meeting in 1964 to help secure a collective third world presence in the global public sphere. Korea became the third Secretary General of UNCTAD in 1974 when the NEIO Declaration was passed. CEPAL and UNCTAD were institutional avenues to decolonizing the politics of knowledge in the field of political economy and development. The third worldist economics policy networks that they drew on and mobilized prioritized the interests of the global south in the analysis of world systems. These networks developed disciplinary knowledges and policy expertise that framed and analyzed strategic choices and trade-offs and gave rise to alternative analytical orientations in the study of the political economy of development. This vibrant heterodoxy in economic thought can itself be situated in a larger milieu of post-colonial theorizing in the 1970s, with critical interventions such as Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and Edward Said's Orientalism emerging in that same decade. Finally, in closing, let me note that, of course, the NEIO provoked a massive backlash that has lessons for today's intertwined struggles against an unjust economic order and the struggle against white supremacy. The backlash to the NEIO extends from neoliberalism's new dawn to the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions that emerged in the following decade. This backlash was about the economic policies represented by the NEIO, but also entangled with it a backlash against the transformed racial composition of the General Assembly. At the 1955 Bandung Conference, President Sukarno's welcoming speech noted that the conference was the largest gathering, what he called colored peoples from across the world. 29 governments were represented at Bandung in 1955. 20 years later, when the NEIO declaration was passed, there were 139 governments represented in the General Assembly, the majority of which were newly independent nations composed of the colored peoples of the tricontinent. The General Assembly was drowning out Europe's voice. Note that the same General Assembly that passed the NEIO created a seat at the table for Palestine while showing South Africa the door. In other words, the neoliberal economic vision was intricately intertwined with a vision of the social order of international society, a vision that was grounded in a racial and civilizational vision of governance and expertise, a belief that the wages of whiteness included a monopoly on economic thought and macroeconomic planning. The NEIO resolution trumpeted that the colored peoples of the world were challenging that monopoly and seizing the reins of power. We are at a very different historical moment today. We have a more chastened view about the United Nations as an instrument of transformation, and we are less likely to equate the right to self-determination with the nation-state form as such. You'd note that the NEIO did not represent an isolationist and atavistic nationalism, but a nationalism embedded in tricontinental internationalism, fundamentally optimistic about the possibilities of collective action to transform the institutional arrangements of international society and legislate towards alternative futures. The energy of contemporary social movements and the boldness of the transformative thinking have a force that resonates with the insurgent and decolonial spirit of the NEIO and are driven by a new sense of forward-looking urgency that speak to the historical conjuncture of the current moment. So on that note, I can think of no better person to sort of begin the rest of our discussions today than the Ambassador Munir Akram. Ambassador Munir Akram is the permanent representative of Pakistan to the United Nations and chair of the G77 plus China among his many previous roles. Ambassador Akram was elected president of the United Nations Economic and Social Council from 2020 to 2021 and was permanent representative to the UN in New York once before from 2002 to 2008, during which time he served 2 terms as president of the Security Council. Ambassador Akram, before you come to the stage, I also want to pose a question to you in your particular position as the head chair of the G77. We saw at COP27 the leadership that Pakistan, acting as chair of G77 and China, exhibited in securing the establishment of a new loss and damage fund and broadly fighting for the interests of the global south in the face of a climate crisis driven by the north. What do you see as the role of the G77 in efforts to advance a new, more equitable global economic order in the context of the polycrises, and how do we navigate the challenge of building a southern movement strong enough to win these concessions? With that easy question, I'll ask you to.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that welcome and for that simple question which you posed. First of all, let me recall that perhaps of the all our friends here, perhaps I was the only one who was actually at the General Assembly in 1974, negotiating the new international economic order. And I happened to chair Section 10 of the Program of Action, which calls for special measures for the most seriously affected developing countries at that time. The new international economic order came about, of course, because of the strength of the anti-colonial movement and the vigor with which the newly independent countries in the General Assembly felt about liberating themselves not only from political domination, but also economic liberation. But it became possible because of the OPEC oil embargo. That was the lever which made our friends, partners, as we say in the North, come to the table to negotiate a new international economic order. But of course, as you have said, no sooner was the ink dry on the document that the modalities to escape the leverage that OPEC had created was then turned around and money rechanneled through the banking system in order to defeat the objectives of the new international economic order. Today, we are in a much more complex crisis. 1974 was a crisis created in balance of payment situation for many developing countries because of the OPEC pricing issue. It gave some developing countries the power. It impacted on other developing countries, but we all came together in order to negotiate as a group in order to get a better deal for all of us. Today, we face a complex crisis, which is the result of the systemic issues we face, but also of a series of events that have happened, the COVID crisis, the supply chain disruption, in commodity inflation, the conflicts we are facing, especially conflict in Ukraine and the accompanying sanctions of the conflict. And now we are facing higher interest rates, the prospect of a global recession, which will impact on at least 82 developing countries who are debt vulnerable, with 54 of them are in debt distress at the moment. So there is a possibility of a collapse. And we need to obviously find ways of coming out of this crisis. We have convened in the Group of 77 a ministerial meeting, which will take place on the 15th and 16th of December, where we try to see some emergency actions to get the developing countries out of this crisis, the 82 countries which are in deep distress, to get them out of this distress, and then to address some of the systemic issues that we are facing. The hope in the current situation, the hope has been on SDR creation and the channeling or rechanneling of special drawing rights, the IMF's special drawing rights to developing countries. And this is an old idea, which was there in the NEIO as well, but this has come to life as one possible modality. The second modality that is being thought of is how to channel the $360 trillion that are held in private wealth, in private hands with asset managers, mostly in this country, but in Europe, how to channel that into the development system. Now, this may be perhaps a far cry. I don't think that we will have the sympathy or the charity required to address the problems of the developing countries. We need systemic change, and we know what these changes are that we need. The economic governance has to change. Multilateral debt crises have to be avoided. We need greater investment flows into the developing countries. We need to halt the illicit financial flows which suck trillions of dollars every year from developing countries. We need an equitable trade regime which will allow developing countries to industrialize and export their goods into the global markets. We need a technology agreement which provides us equitable access to technologies, which focuses research and development on the problems of the developing countries, which promotes digital democracy, because that is what we need in order to cope with the world that is emerging in the digital world. And what can we do? What are the levers today that we have? We do not have the OPEC lever today, but there are, in my views, several levers that the developing countries can utilize at this time. First of all, I think there is a need for a demonstration of developing country unity, and that unity was demonstrated at COP27 when we achieved the agreement on the loss and damage facility. It was an uphill task, but we stuck together. Secondly, you saw what Africa did in the General Assembly in getting an agreement on the tax convention. That was a task that escaped us for many, many years. But today we also have, apart from our unity, we have the climate constituency. The developed countries are exposed to their own constituency, which demands a just climate transition. And that is a constituency which we can utilize in order to exert pressure on the developed country governments. We have great power rivalry. And this rivalry is, of course, bad for us in many ways, but it also revives the old Cold War dynamic where the non-aligned countries and the Group of 77 was able to utilize this rivalry to extract advantages for itself. We have the power of people. Economic activity is moving to countries which have people. China, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Africa. That's where the people are. And that's where economic growth is growing. And that's why economic power is going to move to the countries with the people. And that is another lever we have. We have digitalization, which is going to make it easier for developing country peoples to access the global knowledge in a knowledge-based society. Digital, and last but not least, we have the South's capacity for self-help, which we did not have in the past. Southern countries are now, many of us are developed, industrializing, have the knowledge, have the capacity, and if we work together, we will have the leverage to change the world. So I wish you good luck with the process of creating a new international economic order. Thank you.
Many thanks to the ambassador. I now have the honor of introducing our next guests, my dear friend, el compañero Andrés Arauz. Andrés Arauz served as the General Director of the Central Bank of Ecuador and the Minister of Knowledge and Human Talent under the presidency of Rafael Correa in Ecuador. In 2020, Andrés ran for president as the candidate of the Unión por la Esperanza. Among his many current roles, Andrés is the co-founder of the Observatorio de la Dolarización, a senior research fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and of course, a council member of this Progressive International. Dr. Arauz, it's an honor to have you here with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. I'm very, very happy to be here with you this evening on such an important occasion in historic terms. Like I always like to put in context, we're not here for some easy juncture. We're here actually to try to change the world with history in our minds, with history in our hearts, and with a historic duty as well. So in the spirit of Bandung, I would like to talk about the world anew. I'm very happy that Ambassador Munir talked about the levers that we have in the current context, and I would like to push the frontier a little more. I would like to talk about how we can build this international economic order mostly with collective but unilateral action from the South. There has been a lot of attempts to try to build consensus between the Global South, what is now known as the Global South, and the powers of the North. But there is enough space if we find the political will to act, to start taking some unilateral action and make those levers become reality. I'm here to talk about the right to development, also an institution, a discourse, and a concept born in the context of a new international economic order, but brought upon to today's juncture of the context of global capitalism, late global capitalism, climate crisis, super militarization, and hegemonic confrontation. However, I do have to be brief, so a lot of these issues will be a short but quick list of issues that are already ongoing in many spaces around the world, but that we can act upon if we find that political, which is really mostly common sense. I think we need to find a space for non-alignment, but not just a boring and dull non-alignment. I'm talking about a decolonial, demilitaristic, nationally sovereign, and regionally integrated non-alignment, where we can use the forces of pan-regionalism to create these opportunities for the following that I'm going to mention. I think, and given our experience in Ecuador and many countries in the South, the first and foremost immediate duty of countries and peoples of the South is to dismantle the colonial and neo-colonial institutions that still favor capital over the rights of people and over the right to life, including the rights of nature. We need to replace such a neo-colonial institution as is investor-state arbitration. This is absolutely key because primarily at the World Bank's ICSID forum, the corporations, transnational capital, have overarching rights over that of states and humanity as a whole. Why do we give them the sacrosanct corporate impunity by a transnational treaty? We need to replace this with a binding treaty for human rights for transnational corporations that is already being discussed, and that needs to move much faster. We need to follow examples of countries in the South like Indonesia, India, South Africa, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and even some European countries that have decided to immediately terminate bilateral investment treaties and do away with investor-state arbitration from all international treaties. Why is this so important? Because it will take the teeth away from transnational capital and give the people of the South more policy space to promote development. We need to do away with the privatization of justice and, of course, also the weaponization of justice, as my own country's experience show, to have more space to build our domestic and sovereign alternatives. But we also need to overcome the colonization of money. The colonial nature of dollar hegemony strips countries of sovereign policy-making space when, for example, vulture funds can threaten an entire country in the context of debt restructuring or sovereign debt policy making, or when unilateral financial sanctions can destroy the productive efforts of entire nations, as we have recently seen. We need regional monies and put SDRs at the center of a decolonial money system, as has been an approach pursued by the Global South for already 50 years. We need to reclaim central banks and their international clubs from the influence of bankers and financial capital and deliver them to those concerned with development and the right to development. We need to undo technological colonialism. Modern digital colonialism dictated by a few giant big tech or companies threatens sovereignty and the right to development of the nations of the South. Yes, to appropriate technologies and to democratic standard setting, not to digital colonialism. We need our own data centers, our own champions, our own fiber optic rings, not to unilateral governance of the web, yes, to decolonial internet. We should reject wholeheartedly the super militarization of the digital space and reject mass surveillance. When I was involved in the political campaign very recently, it is almost incredible to think that while you think that you're sharing information with your comrades, it is all being surveilled by the imperial powers. So how can you have a just fight if they know exactly not even what you are writing, but also what you're thinking? How can you take a struggle? How can you lead a struggle when you are completely surveilled? We need a science and technology buy-in for the South, not to the persecution, for example, of Julian Assange, who did the largest transfer of knowledge and technology perhaps in modern history. We cannot wait for TRIPS licenses for solving the climate crisis. We need the trade secrets of climate-efficient technology immediately declared open source and patent-free. The world needs a type of WikiLeaks of technology secrets and the deep privatization of standards. We need to make this knowledge, which is critical in the context of the climate crisis, to be absolutely democratized. We need to update bio-ignorant colonial capitalism. The main institution that we have to change is accounting. Capital lives in accounting. How can the damage to nature and the destruction of life not be included in that which is the main institution of capital? But also macroeconomic accounting should abandon its patriarchal, colonial, ecocidal, and capitalist doctrine and prioritize the human nature nexus. Extraction of nature, for example, adds to GDP, but regeneration of nature doesn't. Selling human organs adds to GDP, but a mother feeding her baby doesn't. No to economic imperialism with speculative bourses setting commodity export prices. Yes to exporter clubs of the South to govern prices and the terms of exchange. No to the ecocide or to greenwashing genocide, and no to extractivism for renewables. Yes to the investment in that key infrastructure that we need for the 21st century. That which mentions high-speed rail, our own fiber, supercomputers, and above all, education for all. No to the war on drugs where the people of the South put the dead bodies and a few consumers in the rich put their noses. No to the hypocrisy of North Atlantic multilateralism, and yes, while here in New York, to moving the United Nations headquarters to the Global South, where most of the world population lives. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good note on which to launch this as well. Sorry. Okay. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Mona Ali, who is an associate professor of economics at the State University of New York at New Paltz. Her research focuses on international trade and finance, multinational corporations, and asymmetries in the global economy, and is the author of a forthcoming book on the weaponization of the global dollar system. Professor Ali, what challenges do countries of the Global South face today as a result of the shape of the global financial and economic architecture, and what might an alternative world look like?
Hi, it's so nice to see people I've admired from afar. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to follow David's instructions, which is to talk about the weaponization of the dollar. So I'll be the party pooper in that instance. But I want to end on a note of sort of solidarity and hope by talking about how we can de-weaponize the dollar. So I'll start talking about this year, and it's been a very troubling year, as most of us have known, where we've seen, a series of catastrophic events, starting with the war in Ukraine, a series of cascading shocks that have engulfed the global economy, the global commodities price shock, followed by the Federal Reserve interest rate hikes starting in March, and then moving on to the dollar at a 20-year high, which far below its March 1985 peak, has still had, this capacity to destabilize balance sheets across the globe because of the dollar's interlacing effects as the currency for debt in the global economy, as well as the global financial and trade currency above all others. The result of this sharp dollar appreciation has been a decline in 90 currency devaluations across the global south. We've seen a movement of capital out of the global south, about $85 billion in bond funds leaving the global south, and countries being forced to run down their foreign exchange reserves of around 379 billion to defend their own currencies. Because we know, and Andrés Arauz has reminded us many times, that when currencies devalue in the global south, that leads to capital exit. So weighed down by dollar liabilities that have led to the repricing of local currency assets on domestic balance sheets in the global south, developing countries are in this really troubling concatenation where the interest rate hikes have caused an increase in debt servicing, and they've had to run down their reserves trying to defend their currencies. More than 60% of the 3.6 trillion in long-term external debt of developing economies is owed to private creditors. So there's been a movement of debt in the global south away from bilateral creditors towards private creditors, towards short-term loans, and all of that with higher interest rates makes for a really troubling concatenation. We see, in 2020-21, a really abysmal failure of the debt service suspension initiative, where countries ended up paying back their bilateral creditors, and they also ended up paying private creditors who were not within the remit of the DSSI. And it looks like debt restructuring is bound to fail again with the common framework. Now, if the liquidity crisis across 29 economies that are facing, both a debt distress situation as well as a climate crisis, if that liquidity crisis becomes an insolvency crisis, then developing countries, the G77, don't have the swap lines that the G7 countries do with the Fed. Major treasury holders in the South can run down their dollar, they can exchange their treasury bills for dollars at the discretion of the Fed. But most countries, find themselves at a loss. And then there are some other countries in the global south, the G77, who've been evicted from the global dollar system altogether because of sanctions imposed on them. And that's where we see weaponization, which is the most overt form of dollar dominance today. We've seen in 2020 the world being beset by more sanctions than any time in our history as a global economy. And the consequences for the global south of sanctions include overcompliance, they include capital flight, they include disrupted cross-border trade, which have knock-on effects on GDP and macroeconomic stability. And so sanctions end up penalizing not just the regime, which is the intended target, but the entire macroeconomy. And it really, we know from countries like Somalia and also Afghanistan that sanctions have contributed to the overlapping crises that engulf those economies. Famine in Afghanistan today, predictable, has led to the US setting up humanitarian trust at the Bank for International Settlements with the money that it itself confiscated from the Afghan government back in 2021. Now, I want to move on to, in 2 minutes, I want to move on to the more optimistic part of my argument, is that while we're dealing with a weaponization of globalization, one should not merely fetishize these choke points or the inherent asymmetry in the international monetary architecture. Instead, we would be better off thinking about the social relations of the international financial architecture rather than just the brute materiality of the global dollar system. And that would be a way of, finding power in rearranging, as many of you have already said, the international financial system for the global South. And such a new architecture is embedded in the new Bridgetown initiative that seeks to use the new $650 billion issuance of SDRs in 2021 towards rechanneling funds for the Climate Mitigation Trust. So SDRs would be the basis of new debt financing on concessional terms for climate resilience in the global South. I'm just wondering, I have a minute. So what it requires, though, is technical effort, right? So we need the technocrats working for the Global South rather than the IMF that need to reconsider the SDR, which is an international reserve asset that's cloistered within central banks. Instead, we need to think of them as, as I think was framed under Bretton Woods, this idea of a source of liquidity and of regular liquidity, and liquidity particularly when the global economy is facing exogenous shocks. And I would argue we need to broaden the scope of the SDR. I think I'm sort of out of time, right? So I'm just wondering what to say here. So I think that's where I want to end. New financing is key. Debt restructuring is key. And that means changing the structure of the IMF and the World Bank that are actually ripping out, debtors by charging market rates. They need to, and I learned this from my friend Andrés, they need to change from a variable rate model towards a fixed interest concessional model. The IMF needs to get rid of its surcharges. People have been thinking about a debtor's cartel as opposed to a creditor's cartel. And so let's think about collective debtors' strike. All right, thanks.
On the note of calling for a debtors' strike across the global South, I think a very inspiring idea from Professor Ali. I'd like to introduce another one of our distinguished guests, Gerardo Torres Zelaya, who is the Vice Foreign Minister of the Republic of Honduras under the first woman president of Honduras, Xiomara Castro, who has come back to power after 13 years in the darkness of a military coup that sent President Manuel Zelaya out of the country. Torres has a very long history in this struggle for democracy and the prosperity of the people of Honduras, and currently acts as International Secretary for Libre, which is a member of our Progressive International and part of our struggle now for a new international economic order. We're very lucky to have him here in New York. It's been a pleasure to accompany you on this journey, and I hope you can tell us a bit about what's happening in Honduras, what it means for the region of America Latina, and for the world at large. So please, Gerardo, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, David. Se puede hacer en español, hay interpretación en inglés, ¿no?
We have interpretation to English,
Bien,
right? Okay.
Muchísimas gracias al Internacional
Thank you
Progresista
so
por la
much,
invitación.
Progressive International, for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here along with different representatives and people from Latin America, with people who dedicate their time to envision a different world at an international global scale. Our President, Xiomara Castro, recently was at the UN making a call in this same sense. We need to change the dominant structure that exists in the world. Honduras is a country that historically has been the most obedient following the financial and military imperialism It's been one of the countries where those principles took root against agrarian reform, land privatization, and neoliberalism at a deep level. And this kind of syndrome, which more than democracy is this belief that voting brings about participation, democratic participation in a country where a large percentage of the population lives in poverty, where 52% of the Honduran population do not have access to food. And therefore, the migrant caravan, it's something that makes sense, right? When you lose your ability to survive, humanity from its beginning has learned that the solution is to move elsewhere where you can survive. In that sense, we have to say that Honduras in the 1980s, while other countries were at open war through their revolutionary processes, Honduras was used to attack the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Salvadoran Revolution, and the Guatemalan Revolution. It was Honduras where they plotted the coup against the Guatemalan president. It was Honduras where they attacked Panama and ongoing attacks against Cuba. So that role that my country has had reflects the history of Latin America. Then it's been my country, along with Argentina and Chile, that started giving away their their national natural resources and then passing it on to the private sector. What was the result of those policies and that level of obedience? Well, Honduras in the 90s became one of the most impoverished countries on the continent. And now we were talking about debt and the experience of highly indebted countries like Haiti, like Honduras, where the globalized world and the world powers had to accept that there were things in their financial logic and in the loans that was unsustainable to ask countries like Honduras, Bolivia, and Nicaragua at the time to pay off their debt was absurd. And so those are like little respites that people forget sometimes, that once in the developed world, this was talked about. And I think that this is what we need in the sense of being able to understand this international logic. The predatory economic model that in my country destroys the forests, rivers, and mountains, and that at international level, the brave legacy of our comrade Berta Cáceres. It's one of the most dangerous countries if you are a woman and an environmentalist, a lawyer, a journalist. But why don't we talk so much about Honduras? Like the rest of, like other countries, we don't talk about Honduras because the things that they accuse despotic and tyrannical governments in Honduras. Honduras fits within the neoliberal logic and democratic logic, and it follows this obedient line of the logic that promotes the industrialized world. We had a little moment where there was a contradiction against this logic and what I called our conservative DNA that unfortunately has controlled us at the government level, because when it comes to the people, we have never stopped fighting. And that was when Zelaya came to power in 2006, towards 2009, where the country was already profoundly impoverished. It decided to turn to the south towards La America, the Caribbean, towards Alba, against that logic of that Honduras followed for 100 years, the time, those years where we called banana republics. And this turn brought about a violent coup d'etat. However, the Honduran people never stopped fighting for 12 years, and for the first time, we organized ourselves at a massive level through a different political current from those that had existed in Honduras. And that is why in November of last year, for the first time in Honduras, a leftist government came to power, a party that hasn't followed traditional party lines, a party that does not fall under the control and hegemony of the US. And it is not a coincidence that for the first time, our party brought a woman to the presidency. So this convergence of factors brought about this change to Honduras, and I'm going to be wrapping up because I'm almost out of time. And in response to this new logic, I think that coming here to talk to you to see how we can develop this logic of a new international economic order in the case of Honduras, it is a very easy conclusion to arrive to. The old economic model never helped us, never gave us answers. And I'll follow up with this. When it comes to a political and economic order and the philosophical underpinnings, we have to think about who controls this order, this established order that exists. So it is not by chance that those who control it are the ones who benefit the most. Is it the majority of the impoverished population? Obviously not. That would be contrary to itself. How do we understand issues around the pandemic, climate change, war, racism, and poverty, right? Why would it be different with an international economic order? Because it would require a different arrangement. What do we need to do to create something similar, to come across with our similarities among those who have debts, those who are impoverished, among those countries that are made vulnerable due to climate change, among those who are exploited and not those who exploit, not those who benefit from the war industry, but those who have had to confront without arms to the war industry, not only the financial logic from the place of those who have never had anything. And we are here at your service on behalf of Honduras to support through this process. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, vicecanciller. Igual, a tus órdenes. I'll go back to English for a moment here. Embajador Joaquin Perez has been Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations for the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela's United Nations for many years now. And his work as Deputy Permanent Representative has included coordinating Venezuela's chairmanship of the non-aligned movements from 2016 to 2019. We talk a lot about non-alignment in the context of the war in Ukraine. Many of us in this country forget that there is a non-aligned movement that has an architecture around the world. And we'd love to hear a bit more about what it means, this question of a new non-aligned movement, a renovated non-aligned movement, and what the experience of Venezuela has been navigating these questions of a weaponized dollar and the existing international order. So thank you very much, and I welcome you to the floor, Embajador Joaquín Pérez.
Buenas noches. Good evening. I'll switch back to Spanish.
Voy a cambiar de nuevo al español. We want to appreciate the Progressive International for this important convening at the People's Forum, and thank you for their hospitality. We feel like we're at home every time we're at the People's Forum. The world today confronts one of the deepest crises in the past century. This is a multifaceted crisis, multidimensional, that has exposed the great inequalities between the North and the Global South, and we are still confronting COVID-19 and a slow recuperation in the environmental front with the adverse effects on the climate that are a threat to all humanity. And when we talk about security, there are a number of people that go hungry throughout the world. and there can be multiple famines in the near future. And I will take a brief pause, and I would like to highlight that it is of the utmost importance to create true sovereignty, and we want to talk about all of the programs of TCP, and we also want to note that the executive director would reflect the same remarks. And as far as the price of the volatile price of petroleum, this has been a situation that has created an increase in the cost of global transportation, which the other ambassador had already touched upon. And it is important to highlight the role of Petrocaribe and its role and when what Petrocaribe could contribute to the world if Venezuela were not subject to economic aggression through by part of the United States. And then we also need to touch on the scarcity and also of the social issues of many at the border of not only an economic reception but an economic collapse that someone else already touched on. And we also want to alert folks around any possible temptation that countries may have to succumb to neoliberal packages that only respond to the interests of, of large corporations. All of you here today, instead of discouraging us, this should motivate us to create a just implementation and development. And this is something necessary, not only urgently so, but also this is a time for unity, solidarity, and cooperation, a sign of truly inclusive multilateralism to overcome the global crisis and reach a document that will rescue the spirit of over 50 years ago and will lead us to a new declaration that is acclimated to the realities of the world today and will permit us to finally establish a new international economic order that is truly just and equal, which would allow us to live in true harmony with nature. The conditions of the current new international economic order calls for an update of the established norms, including the dependency that has impeded the human right of countries in the global south to develop. It is important to eradicate hunger and poverty at a global level. This should be our primary priority. As far as the distribution of vaccines for COVID-19, we need relief, the correction of the deficit of finances, also inclusion of being at this power to make decisions at the economic table. And last but not least, we seek for the unilateral lifting of economic and financial sanctions and what we know colloquially as the sanctions, these extraterritorial sanctions have further exacerbated the crisis that humanity is confronting. This is also prolonging the suffering at a global scale unless we immediately seize these extra-legal and extra-legal circumstances, and also we want to overcome the current situation. And on the part of Venezuela, we want to continue to constructively work towards the changes that will lead us to the creation of a new international economic order that is truly just and equal, including the deepening of international solidarity and the inclusion of the ability to be able to independently and sovereignly develop. We are grateful that there are different solidarity movements in spaces like the People's Forum and we firmly, and the firm commitment and the diplomacy of the Bolivarian. And also, as far as non-aligned movements, I also subscribe to the words of Andrés. What we need is a new non-alignment, not the previous one in the last 60 years that has not responded to the interests of the large majority of people.
Hi, I'm very glad to, welcome next speaker, Professor Sakido Fudokapa, who's a professor of international affairs at the New School, where her work focuses on human rights, development, and global health. From 1995 to 2004, Professor Pary was lead author and director of the UNDP Human Development Reports, and among many other roles, she serves on the UN Committee on Development Policy as vice chair and the Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicines and innovation, and is co-director of the independent panel on global governance for health at the University of Oslo. So we're very glad to have her join us.
Thank you very much. I have to lower the microphone even further. This is such a wonderful event, and I'm so delighted to have this privilege of being able to share my thoughts with you. So I'm going to speak to a couple of points about decolonizing global health. And the first is about technology and the need for global governance of technology based on the principles of right to development. Other speakers have spoken about the right to development as an essential element of NEIO for the 21st century. So the 20th century NEIO focused on access to technology and technology transfer. But this needs to be rethought in the context of this century, because this century's 21st century capitalism is often characterized as monopoly capitalism. Economies are increasingly dominated by oligopolistic industries and firms. Control of intellectual monopolies on technologies has become the foundation of many businesses. The contradiction between this system and the need for essential global public goods has been painfully visible as we live through the pandemic and the release of COVID-19 vaccines. You know, these things were hailed as fantastic scientific achievements to save humanity, but its distribution, as we all know, was so highly skewed that Dr. Tedros, the Director General of WHO, calls the situation vaccine apartheid. You know, as we saw that the virus spread like wildfire across the globe, world leaders made these lofty declarations about commitment to solidarity. And for example, President Macron tweeted, "Vaccines are a global public good," you know, and then he said, "Vaccination is a global public." There's a difference in that. That was instilled the narrative, but the reality is the total opposite. The institutional arrangements that were made for vaccine development, distribution, created basically private goods, not public goods, with intellectual property held by these monopolistic firms like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and others, despite the fact that research, development, manufacturing had been backed by billions of dollars of public financing. For example, Operation Warp Speed in the United States put up, you know, 10 or more, $12 billion. But the problem goes beyond the record profits made by these companies. I understand Pfizer made like $7 billion on the COVID vaccines, or the lack of access by low-income countries is the governance of the system, the public health research, development distribution that relies on free market and intellectual monopolies to create incentives for investment that is totally incompatible with public priorities. So the model of medical investment that creates that creates medications at hideously high prices, accessible only for a few, and an absence of governance to ensure that medical research and innovation addresses global health priorities. There's a clear mismatch. So this is not just a result of the model of monopoly capitalism. It's also part of global architecture of health that is neo-colonial in its power structure and practices. And this is what needs to be remade or worked around. Global health as a field is rooted in colonial history of medicines as a complement to military conquest and colonization, and to the economic exploitation of colonies. The institutions that have evolved reflect this history in many ways. Just as an example, the whole history of pandemic preparedness and response is predicated on the assumption that infectious diseases originate in poor countries of Africa and Asia and pose a threat to people living in Europe and North America. And it is the protection of those populations in North America and Europe, which is a primary objective around which these global arrangements have been designed. The international health regulations, for example, is primarily aimed at reporting outbreaks to international authorities so that they don't spread, and says nothing really about protecting populations within these countries so that they don't then spread elsewhere. But ironically, the geography of COVID pandemic contradicts these assumptions. It was a failure to contain the virus in Europe and North America, which actually created hotspots and the source for global contagion. And yet, the colonial hierarchy of knowledge assumes that the West has the best expertise and knowledge for pandemic response. And somehow this entrenched assumption that the West knows best just has never kind of been challenged. And it is, as somebody coming from Asia, I find this really rather annoying that nobody really wants to know what Asian countries did. And most people sort of somehow think about China and surveillance and so forth when we talk about the Asian experience. So a global governance structure is needed, built on the principles of human rights and the right to development. And that sets the objective as a constant improvement in the well-being of individuals through a process of social justice. And what is important about human rights and the right to development is that human rights create obligations on states to ensure the realization of rights. And the right to development is the only international human rights principle that articulates very explicitly obligations extraterritorially. That is, for example, vaccine access is something that countries are obligated to facilitate not only for their own citizens, but for all people of the world. And this is why these are the ethical principles around which solidarity and a new design of global health architecture needs to be built as a priority in the new NEIO for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel excited that we're covering so much ground in this very capacious paradigm of the new international economic order. Now it's really an honor for me to introduce our next guest. Diego Pary Rodriguez has served as the permanent representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia to the United Nations since 2020. If I remember correctly, actually, we met in La Paz during those elections that brought back democracy to the country after the coup in 2019. Prior to this appointment, he served in a variety of roles in the Bolivian government, including the ambassador to the OAS, the Organization of American States, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs under President Evo Morales. Embajador, es un gusto, es un placer, es un honor contar con la participación Y por favor, la palabra es suya para hablar sobre ese proyecto del nuevo orden económico internacional. Gracias.
Thank you very much, David.
Muchísimas gracias, David.
Friends,
Amistades.
muchas gracias. Voy a
Thank
volver
you
al
so
español.
much. I'm going to switch back over to Spanish. Thank you to all of those that are here with us today. It is, after so many important presentations from Andrés, the colleagues from Venezuela, Honduras, Ambassador of Pakistan, we're talking about this very important topic, but to understand the position of Bolivia, it is also important to understand how Bolivia has changed the past few years, or throughout the years. As Honduras has mentioned, Bolivia has also been one of the countries very strongly affected by the neoliberalist system that has destroyed our economy, society, and we have experienced transformation with the arrival of the first indigenous president, Evo Morales, who has made two central structural systematic changes. They have looked for representatives of throughout the country to essentially change the institutionality of the state. The second important transformation, and this has been the foundation for many other transformations, which has been the nationalization of our natural resources and the nationalization of our. This has also allowed us not only to have economic resources, but to also create a viable state, a state that has changed the economic structure and that has the economic foundation to implement those transcendental changes that were needed in the country. This 14-year process started by Evo has been very important, and unfortunately, the Bolivian right, the conservative sectors of Bolivia, the Latin American right did not forgive Evo for these changes. And in 2019, here we have the coup. And as a product of the elections that took place, where Evo Morales had won the election freely and fairly, but due to the right-wing political factors and actors assisted by the OEA, there a fraudulent election was claimed, which has been absolutely false, and those that would denounce that they could not demonstrate any evidence to this fact. There is not a document that exists that was presented that this had not occurred. The people gave us the reason. Evo Morales was no longer able to be a candidate, but someone else was elected to the presidency, and Cora won the elections. In all of the places, in all of the votation tables, in all of the voting tables where the OEA indicated fraud, the party of Evo, the party of Cora, won with over 56% of the votes. This is to say that the general election that we had won in October of 2019 with 47% of the vote, in 2020 we won it with 55, close to 56% of the vote. That means with an even greater percentage. The Bolivian people united, reclaimed their democracy and their democratic institutions. And this is an experience that is unique to Bolivia because the coup only lasted a year. This is the only country where in 1 year we were able to recover democracy, and now we have a democratic government that is working for its people, that is continuing to implement these transformations. So aside from this introduction, right before I am out of time, I would like to share with you all what is our vision of a new international economic order. For us, it is very important to understand what context we are in at this moment. The multilateral system, first of all, is there's a new multipolar system. There's not just a few hegemonies that control conditions. There are some hegemonies that, yes, control countries and pressure countries to maintain them under their yoke of power that we are historically aware of. But this loss of control by the large traditional hegemonies to generate unilateral sanctions, it creates economic depressions in countries, and this presents a series of difficulties. We also have the issue, we have the UN, which is a space that we actively participate in, but it still continues to be a, not the most effective space. We have many debates, but it affects the impact it can have on the people. We need to be much more effective and concise with the decisions that are taken. We acknowledge that we are in a climate, economic, multifaceted crisis of values, and we think that for us to be able to create a new international economic order, we need to redirect financial investment. Finances need to be directed to education, to health. They need to address basic needs, to address the basic needs of the people. And the restitution and the privatization of basic needs, they cannot be privatized. They need to be the responsibility of the states. The issue of the redefining of international organisms, these international organisms, primarily the financial ones, need to be more democratic, and they need to cease being neoliberal financial institutions. And we also need a universal basic income to be able to meet basic needs. And we also think it is important to create a more just international commerce where nations have the capacity to sovereignly control the trade while they face multinational corporations. And so, and one more thing before my time is up is the topic of climate change. It is true that the energetic shift is important for all of our countries, but we cannot be under the same conditions as developing and developed countries. For Bolivia, for example, eliminating certain times of fossil fuels would be impossible, but let's say it would be a possibility for Denmark or other more developed countries, which this needs to be a process of transition with just conditions, but developing countries cannot meet the same conditions as developing countries. The conditions are completely different. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I confess I've long had both admiration and envy of the Latin Americans for listening to so many both current and past government officials with such a radical vision of world order. Is not common in the rest of the world. It's my pleasure to introduce our next guest, Bhumika Muchhala, a political and feminist economist and senior policy advisor at the Third World Network. She has 20 years of experience in advocacy, research and analysis, campaigning and public education on the international financial system, sustainable development, feminist economics, climate justice, colonial histories, and decolonial theory and practice. She's been engaged in numerous UN conferences, such as the World Economic Crisis Conference of 2009 and the Financing for Development conferences, and is involved in global movements for debt and tax justice and countering austerity. Welcome.
Thank you, Vasuki. Thank you, David. This is a fantastic, absolutely brilliant event, and 2 years in advance, so precocious at that. never, as everyone has been saying, the time for it, NIO is now in a cascade of intersecting, layered multiplicity of crisis. It is now that the world economy needs to be rethought and really reconstructed from a pivotal place. So when we're looking at the NIEO, one of the most bold elements that was incredibly inspiring was how the NIEO linked colonial history to the creation of an international racialized and gendered hierarchy that structures the global economic order. First. And second is that decolonization involves a multiplicity and plurality of political projects that lead to global justice. There is no one size fits all. There is no singularity. And in this kind of project, there was then a multiplicity of demands, redistribution of wealth and resources flowing from the south to north, redressing an exploitative international and sexual division of labor, democratizing multilateralism, and striving for economic self-determination in the south. So here we are at this current inflection point. We have financialization and increasingly green financialization and climate colonialism. We have one of the greatest sovereign debt distress crises in recent modern economic history. We have the ongoing waves of illicit financial flows and recurrent waves of fiscal austerity. One key point is that every crisis has been an inflection of a resurgence of austerity policies, namely fiscal austerity and consolidation, where women are really the shock absorbers and embody the nation's debt through the appropriation of their time, their labor, and their mental and psychological well-being. And so we see also wealth inequality, the pandemic exacerbating it. Indeed, since the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, the top 1% owns half the world's total household wealth. The state of play of the world economy calls for an effort to reconceptualize and reclaim an NIEO2. Here I propose a few elements that an NIEO2 might address in a remaking. First, the concept and the phenomenon today of international financial subordination, expressed through money and finance as a fundamental driver of reproducing global inequalities, inscribed within the free, unregulated movement of capital, in particular speculative portfolio capital, and the global currency hegemony led by the US dollar, which has already been spoken to. But what it really entails is an entire complex of financial norms and standards, open exchange rate regimes, low inflation and deficit targets defined by the Maastricht Treaty, tax, environment, and labor standard deregulations, and the vulnerability of domestic interest rates to that of the movement of international interest rates. This together illustrates how South nations, at various levels of economic power, have no choice but to internalize the steep costs associated with obtaining and maintaining market confidence and attracting investors and creditors. At the center of this financial subordination is the specter of sovereign debt distress and crises. Total debt in the developing world stands at a 50-year high. 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress or high risk of debt distress. But there is a structural disadvantage of debtors, palpable within the void of a multilateral debt restructuring mechanism that convenes all creditors, bilateral, multilateral, and private. Developing countries through the G77 have repeatedly actually called for a multilateral debt restructuring mechanism under the auspices of the United Nations. In fact, this is a long-standing call, going back to the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, where the chief economist of the IMF had proposed a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, consequently immediately shut down by the US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers in 1998. So to come back to the international financial subordination and the debt restructuring at the center of it is a constellation of ratings, rankings, and assessments. And this constellation of ratings, rankings, and assessments tie the current world economy to the sort of disciplinary mechanisms that were exacted by colonial history. Credit rating agencies, the IMF's annual surveillance reports, the wide network of financial market reports and indexes, assessments and listings, the World Bank's doing business indicators, all comprise a very coherent complex, a systemic arena where developing countries are rated and ranked, assessed and judged, and de facto pitted against each other. And this competitive compliance that is generated exercises unprecedented political influence as well as structural power over economic self-determination. So a remaking of NEIO has to address the standards, surveillance, rankings, and ratings complex that produces a kind of normative compliance and internalized compliance within South states. There is no direct imposition that can be seen as an IMF loan conditions, but we can see this affecting to a kind of indirect rule that harks back to the way discipline is exacted from actors of power. So meanwhile, you know, with the void of a debt restructuring mechanism, today we see a travesty where debt servicing amounts to approximately 25% of government spending across the South, approximately twice that of education spending and 9.5 times that of health spending. So an NEIO for today must contend with how this financial subordination is directly implicated in the geographical transfer of value across the world market, not just tax evasion, but also interest rate transfers, which go largely unnoticed. Over the last 20 years, 4.2 trillion has flowed from the global South to the North in interest rate transfers alone. Interventions to address the structural violence and inequity baked into the global economy need to be systemic, iterative, and reparative in scope, reorienting policy formulations by transforming the very ideologies that uphold them. One thing to note is at the core of these ideologies are the narratives, imaginaries, representations, knowledges, and technologies which construct the South as extractive destinations. And this did not happen during the neoliberal era alone. This is embedded in the long history of race, colonialism, and empire. A second key element I'd like to propose is that of epistemic justice towards the decolonization of today's neoclassical economic theory and knowledge. This means engaging with a pluralism of theories, methods, and praxis. A remaking of the NEIO today must go far beyond dominant neoclassical economics. It must employ feminist, ecological, Marxist, Keynesian, post-Keynesian, developmentalist, and structuralist economics, where neoclassical economic theory says that societies are made up of rational and selfish individuals, risk is calculable, choices, exchange, and consumption are the most important, and the free market will automatically correct inefficiencies. Structural feminist and heterodox economics says that societies are composed of gender unequal class structures, the world is complex and uncertain, the most important domain of economies is production and human welfare, including the care and informal economies, and that the state must use active fiscal policy to redistribute income and wealth and resources to the poor, diversify economies, create decent work opportunities, and protect local and small businesses. So steeped in these realities, a resurgent NEIO, what can that look like? How can it imagine and reimagine multilateralism, reformulate the international financial subordination that is a reality today? And how can it transcend a multiplicity of spaces, places, and actors from the UN and the IMF to the streets of Jakarta and Cairo? So with that, I conclude with really calling for a reinvigoration, not of the G20 and BRICS, which often replicate the dominant neoclassical models of extraction and privatization and liberalization, but really the kind of calls already existing within the G77. The G77 across the UN, across trade and climate, to bring together the calls and the content and the initiatives for a tax body, for debt restructuring, into a coherent charter that can really put forward an NEIO for today. Thank you.
Our next guest comes with an announcement that I'm very happy to make. We began the program today saying that this is the launch, the inauguration of a process that will take us to September 2024 in the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. I'm very pleased to announce today that we are in the process of consolidating a Congress on the new international economic order next month in Havana, Cuba, alongside the conference for the world in equilibrium, where we'll be convening with friends and members from around the world to continue this conversation on the island as Cuba prepares to take over the presidency of the Group of 77 from Pakistan. So on that note, I'd like to invite the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Republic of Cuba at the United Nations, Justino Romero Puentes, to come offer some remarks as we embark on the G77 presidency of Cuba.
Muchas gracias. Buenas noches.
Thank you so much. Good evening. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak at this event. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a challenge for all countries and populations of the planet. Its spread and the rapid unleashing of its negative socioeconomic consequences demonstrated how interconnected our economies really are. However, the impact has not been proportional in every nation of the world, given the different levels of development and the specific conditions of each country. The permanence of an unjust international economic order that perpetuates dependence and relegates the countries of the South to second place has undoubtedly contributed to these differences. Humanity counts with sufficient scientific and technical potential and material resources to overcome the pandemic and the various challenges that have been presented to us. However, there is a lack of real political will by industrialized countries to develop fair economic relations. Inequality and injustice are deepening in the world. 150 million additional people faced hunger in 2021 compared to 2019. The global poverty rate rose sharply considerably from 2019 to 2020, from 8.3% to 9.2%. This is the first increase in extreme poverty since 1998 and the largest increase since 1990. This wiped out more than 4 years of sustained steady progress. We see worsening inequality and social polarization in the world. A new billionaire emerges every 26 hours, while inequality continues to contribute to the death of at least one person every 4 seconds. It is estimated that 1 in 10 people in the world suffer from hunger. In addition to this, one can add the dilemma faced by developing countries, which in addition to protecting their populations, they are subject to paying an external debt, which has increased from $6.5 trillion in 2011 to $11.1 trillion in 2021, almost double in 10 years. While paradoxically, world military expenditures grew by 0.7% in real terms. What has killed so many lives is not only a respiratory disease, it is a disease of inequality, the disease of the new international economic order. And against this backdrop, it is clear that it is essential to transform the unjust international economic order and the existing unequal relationship of production and trade. Of course, Cuba acknowledges the establishment of a new international economic order of 1974. It was a great precedent, and every 2 years since then we have coordinated in the interior of the G77. We seek a resolution to follow up on these documents and highlight their relevance, despite the fact that they have been relegated in history, with the argument that conditions are different and that the problems of today's world are different from those that prevailed in the 70s. Nothing could be further from the truth. Hence, taking advantage of the occasion of its 50th anniversary, it is necessary more than ever to create a new international economic order based on equity, sovereignty, equality, mutual benefit, and cooperation amongst all states. A new order that is more participatory and much more inclusive. Of course, this new order needs to reject the economic pressure of developed countries on developing countries that violates the new charter of the UN. A new order is possible. Our country is an example of how much can be done with so little when there is political commitment that works in the service of the interests of the people. Cuba still makes progress. We faced the COVID pandemic with our own vaccines. And we were able to send 58 medical brigades to 42 countries and territories in the worst, at the height of the pandemic. Cuba asked for global solidarity and cooperation. Today is more relevant than ever. Multilateralism, solidarity, and the promotion of development. We need to reclaim the principles in the NEIO and act collaboratively in favor of future economies. We are happy to host in 2023 with the purpose of sharing ideas, especially under our presidency of the G77. We are just about to start in January, but the event in Cuba forms part of an initiative, and the coming year will be a great moment for establishing unity and creating great change the international community needs to create a more just society. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, embajador. We'll conclude the in-person sessions before we turn to our virtual contributions with now a dear friend and a member of our Progressive International Council, Sacha Llorenti. Sacha is the Secretary General of the Alianza Bolivariana para los Pueblos de Nuestra América, ALBA TCP. From 2012 to 2019, Llorenti served as the permanent representative of Bolivia at the United Nations under President Evo Morales, during which time he served as the president of the Group of 77, and prior to that, in government. So Sacha is a veteran of many of the issues we've discussed tonight. We thought of no better representative to take us through many of these questions than him. Sacha, por favor, la palabra es suya. Gracias por venir.
I'm not that old to be a veteran, really, but muchísimas gracias por la invitación y por la
oportunidad. For the invitation and for the opportunity to be here with you all. It is truly a privilege. I have the privilege of being the last person to speak, and after such good presentations, I really have very little to say. I want to share some of the experiences that we've had in the last few years. As the Cuban ambassador said, the pandemic has really truly shown us how the world works. I believe that we should not forget the inequality, even how international piracy has worked when equipment was destined to a Caribbean country. You had the US that went and grabbed it and brought it here. And the same thing, we see how they have taken over the vaccines, how countries like Canada accumulated 4 or 5 times its population, the amount of vaccines. And we also witnessed how African countries were the last ones to get vaccines, while vaccines over here were going bad. And we are seeing how the neoliberal model and the capitalist model work, and how the multilateral system has not worked. There hasn't been a global coordinated arrangement that could reach around the world. And if this is our current situation in the face of something like the pandemic that caused millions of deaths, how are we going to face other global threats that put human existence at risk? They made reference to climate change. That's an existential threat. Same thing when it comes to inequality, who the Cuban representative talked about, and also the destruction of our ecology, our environment, and even these war conflicts that we're seeing now, the ghost of destruction and total annihilation is coming back through nuclear weapons. Where is the UN? Where is the multilateral system? It has been weakened by the interest of those who control the economic and financial system around the world. I wonder, there's many people here who have ample experience with the UN. Could it be possible for us to pass to if we were to pass this at the General Assembly, the Bill of Rights, or that's not to say other resolutions like this one that was adopted over 50 years ago. Do we meet those conditions now? I think that we're very far from that because there has been a breaking away and weakening of the multilateral system. And the questions here are very clear. Who controls science and technology? Who controls the financial system? Who controls access to resources? Who controls the weapon industry? Who controls the media communication? It's exactly the same people. It's those few people who, as a result of inequality, control the planet. But even under those circumstances, multilateralism is still the answer. The coordinated effort of the people and the governments, it is still the answer to counteract this perverse logic. I want to give you some positive examples because as the Silvia Rodriguez song goes, singer, songwriter, Cuban, we have to realize who the antagonist of humanity is, of life. It's capitalism and colonialism and imperialism. On the other hand, there's another Argentinian singer who passed away not too long ago, Mercedes Sosa, who sings a song who said that everything was lost? Not everything is lost. Go ahead, applaud, clap, because it's worth remembering. 18 years ago, Comandante Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez made the decision to create the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of our America that was conceived as a structure not only of political coordination, but also economic, commercial, and financial coordination to prioritize, to confront the agenda that came from this country. And this Bolivarian alliance, despite its limitations, despite its constant and systematic attack through coercive measures and against its members, it has really have moving accomplishments thanks to the support and solidarity of the Venezuelan nation. Countries like mine, like Bolivia, are free of illiteracy. There's no illiteracy. Countries like Venezuela, there's no illiteracy. There's been lots of contributions towards health, improving health. Millions of people recover their eyesight for free. And we've recovered our solidarity, how to share the little that we have, not in examples like I just shared, solidarity when it comes to Cuba, Venezuela, and their proposals. And there's many examples of what my fellow speaker said. Can you imagine what Cuba would be able to do without the economic, financial blockade imposed by the US? Not only what the vaccine production has demonstrated, we were the only country in America and the Caribbean in the global south that produced its own vaccines, but even then, in the middle of such difficult and harsh circumstances, Cuba sent doctors even to Italy, to Europe, at the height of the pandemic. The same thing with Venezuela. The huge solidarity from the government of Nicolas Maduro, that even in the most difficult circumstances, thanks to the work of ALBA as a whole, ALBA was the only multilateral organization that created a humanitarian fund for the distribution of vaccines among its members. That's why the smallest countries of our alliance was able to have access to vaccines thanks to that humanitarian fund as a different way of understanding the reality. The same thing with the ALBA Bank, different credit structure from those of those so-called developed banks. I ran out of time, but I still have more to say. So I'll just finish with this. Through ALBA, through a group of political thinking centers in the global south, in Africa, America, Asia, and also Europe, we came up with this document. And this is essential to have a conversation. It's a living document. It can be changed, edited, etc. It was created to, I call them thought centers. Why do people always use this terminology around weapons? And these are more projects for peace and development. Thank you so much.
We now want to turn to our wonderful virtual contributions for the friends and distinguished guests who could not be here with us tonight. We turn first to Dr. Thomas Isaac, the former finance minister of the state of Kerala, India.
"50 years ago, so many countries in the world, accounting for the majority of the world's population, came together to demand a new international economic order. That effort was certainly important and provided an insight into many of the problems faced by developing countries, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. Instead, we got a revival of, if you like, the power of those who already controlled the global economy, large corporations based in the advanced countries. And we then got a phase of neoliberal capitalism led by global finance that has dramatically altered the landscape. Since then, of course, much has happened. We have had not only the emergence of much greater power of capital over labor, but also the emergence of countries that have achieved significant development progress, such as China, without following those official rules of the game. And that's important because that has changed the world in a way that has generated more potential multipolarity, and that always provides spaces for development and for greater equality. But I think what we have to do now to make the new desire for a new international economic order fit for the 21st century is to actually reconsider and to push back and claw back some of the rights that we have lost over the past 50 years, and to reinvent what we see as a just, equitable, sustainable, viable international economy. So that would mean, to begin with, at the national and international level, but certainly at the national level, to rethink and undo the major privatizations of the past 50 years. The privatizations of the commons and of nature, of land, of water, of forests, of so many other resources. The privatization of public services, which has forced many more people to rely on monetary incomes to get the most basic needs and services, and has forced a financialization of many of these services that used to be publicly delivered. To reverse the privatization of knowledge and of technologies, which has meant increasing concentration of the most essential knowledge that is required not only to meet our social goals, but to save the planet. Essentially, we have to now start thinking of how to make our economies work for the common good, for the public interest, for society and for nature and for the planet. Instead of constantly thinking of how each of these elements of how people, workers, health for all, etc., all of these can serve the economy. That's how typically it is presented, that all of these things have to serve the economy. Instead, we have to make the economy serve all of these goals. That's really why we have economies at all. We are organizing our societies along ways in which we want to deliver our social goals and increasingly to be in harmony with nature and the planet. Now, what does that mean? It's many things. It means that we have to restore public wealth, which has declined dramatically over the last 30 years in particular. Across the world, we have seen that public wealth has declined with the privatization of state-owned assets, the decline in various kinds of commons, and the inability to tax the rich and large corporations, which has meant that there is really, therefore, no money available, no fiscal space available to meet the rights, economic and social rights of ordinary citizens. We need to bring in regulations that actually place human rights, environment, planet, nature above the rights of corporations, above the rights of the extremely wealthy. And this means moving away from a notion where markets can deliver all of the outcomes that we want, and recognizing that they have to be constrained, regulated in the public good, in the common interest, in order to meet our other goals. We have to obviously drastically reform our global food systems. Food systems today are not just unsustainable and unviable, but they're deeply damaging to our health, to the planet, to the environment. They generate enormous amounts of carbon emissions. They generate unhealthy forms of consumption. They generate the inability to feed large numbers of our people across the world when others are suffering from the malnutrition of excess. And so we need to think of sustainable food systems, which are also equitable and available to all. We need to control and direct finance. I think that is beyond question now, because currently we have a financial system that is simply not fit for purpose, that is generating fragilities, vulnerabilities across the world, creating financial cycles that provide no advantage to anyone except profits to financial companies and banks. And we need to bring finance in line with the kinds of investments that we need for society and for nature. I mentioned already that we have to tax the rich. That's partly the reason we cannot do so is because we have a global architecture of taxes, which is a century old and which is completely unfit for purpose in the 21st century. We are still treating multinational corporations as individual corporations in each country, which allows them to actually shift profits to low tax jurisdictions and avoid paying the taxes that even local companies pay. We are enabling high net worth individuals, the extremely rich, to move their money around the world to different tax havens without declaring beneficial ownership and avoiding wealth taxation in multiple ways. These are all things that can be resolved very quickly and easily if we actually engage in genuine tax cooperation that is designed to benefit governments and people rather than the large corporations and the extremely rich. We have to therefore make sure that governments do not fall prey to the control of these very same elites who are currently forcing regulations or enabling loopholes that allow all of this tax avoidance to occur. All of this, as I mentioned, requires a different kind of multilateral architecture. Currently, it's not just not fit for purpose, it's actually actively destroying our economies and our ability to survive on this planet. It is generating massive climate change, which is occurring much more rapidly than even the IPCC reports had predicted. Each IPCC report recognizes that they had underestimated the scope, intensity, and damage created by already occurring climate change. And we have urgently to move to actually prevent, mitigate, adapt, and provide compensation for loss and damage. That requires huge investment. That means that we cannot anymore think of this as something that national governments have to provide. We have to see this as global public investment that requires a global approach, because climate change doesn't recognize visas, passports, national borders. So we have to actually treat this as a planetary problem, as a human problem. And we have to actually find the cooperation that will generate the kinds of global public investment that are necessary and urgent. This means, for example, the multilateral development banks, not just the World Bank and the regional development banks, but all the different multilateral banks and financing institutions that are being thought of, have to be redesigned to respond to these challenges, to deal with public health requirements and emergencies, to address the needs of investment, to mitigate, adapt to climate change, to meet the sustainable development goals, which are not on track at the moment and which are definitely not going to be met, especially in the poorer countries and for the bottom half of the global population. We have to repurpose the IMF, which has unfortunately not been able to deal with the essential challenges for which it has actually was created, which is to provide and enable countercyclical lending when it is required, to deal with episodes of debt distress and prevent the kind of cycles of terrible debt crises and damage done to economies because of these inabilities to pay, to enable debt restructuring and debt relief wherever required, to provide liquidity to all countries, and particularly to those countries who are short of it, instead of simply a global system in which finance can just create money out of a hat. Public finance can be generated for the rich countries when they need it, as in the COVID-19 pandemic, but is simply unavailable to the rest of the world, to low and middle income countries, because they, for fear of capital flight, for fear of the reactions of private investors and the markets, are unable to produce the same kinds of fiscal response or even monetary response that their own economies need and their own societies need. All of this can be done. It's not impossible. And remember, these institutions which feel like they are written in stone, they were all actually created by human minds, human ingenuity, if you like, and they can be undone by human minds and by human ingenuity. Most of all, also, in addition to all of this, we need to consider the concentration of knowledge, which has become something that is actually obscene and actively killing people. We saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the continued control over patents of vaccines and drugs that were developed with huge amounts of public subsidy remained in private hands and were not distributed, so that wider production was simply not allowed. The knowledge about these technologies was not disseminated in a way that we could ensure that everybody was adequately protected through vaccination, or that even currently those who are getting the disease can be adequately treated through the therapeutic devices that are already available. We have to do something about the terrible, iniquitous and unjust regime of intellectual property rights, not only because, of course, we are unable to deal with public health emergencies because of this, but also because it will actively prevent our ability to deal with climate change. We cannot hope for global climate change mitigation unless we widely disseminate these technologies. That means the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement has to be reconsidered. It has to be reworked to recognize the urgent needs for the wider dissemination of essential knowledge. And again, this is something that can be done. It's a relatively new agreement. It was done because of active lobbying by a relatively small group of powerful lobbies in the rich countries. It can be undone if we have sufficient countervailing power, if we actually try to put people's power versus the power of large corporations that are able currently to influence governments. So I think there has never been a more important time to talk about a new multilateralism in a very rapidly changing world. Now that we know that the existing structures of multilateralism are simply not working, they are not generating either peace or stability or security or economic viability or planetary sustainability, we have to rethink these institutions. We have to think the international architecture that will work in the current global situation. And it is possible simply because the world is actually more fragmented now for geopolitical reasons and economic reasons. And that fragmentation provides an opportunity for all of us who are concerned with much broader economic justice to think of and to work towards generating a genuinely progressive alternative.
Hello, everybody in the audience. Greetings to the new generation of progressives from a dinosaur, somebody who was young like you some 50 years ago. The title of my little intervention is NEIO today is as relevant as ever, and even more so. Anyway, those very early days were full of optimism and hope. The developing countries had the wind in their sails. Now was established G77, UNCTAD, UNIDO, etc. And there was an expectation and a strong feeling that through negotiations with the North, progress will be made and things will be changed in the international economic system and in favor of developing countries and their development needs. Then UNCTAD was established after the UNCTAD conference in 1964, and negotiations began, but they were rather slow and difficult. At that point, around 1970, OPEC was established, and the whole episode with the rise of oil prices began, and that was a time when there was an optimism also that the new bargaining power, thanks to OPEC, of the developing countries would result in some progress on the North-South issues. And it is in this context that NEIO was born, initially within NAM, non-aligned movement, and then at the Algiers summit of the non-aligned, and from there it was transposed also to the G77 in the UN, and we had first the 6th special session of the General Assembly on raw materials, and then the 7th special session, which was supposed to tie all this together into a package. Again, this was a point in time when there was a lot of optimism and hope for progress on the international development agenda, thanks to this new lift and thanks to an expansion of the agenda because of the intervention by non-aligned movement, which bolstered the agenda of the G77, which was a bit more conservative due to a number of Latin American countries which were not members of NAM. Well, all of this led eventually to the establishment of the Brandt Commission on North-South Issues, which met in 1981 on the basis of the NEIO declaration of the 6th special session, on the basis of the outcomes of the 7th special session and so on. And it is this Cancun summit, at which participated also newly elected Mr. Reagan, President of the US, and Mrs. Thatcher of England, that was a turning point in the North-South relations, I think. Essentially, they said all this that you're asking for is nonsense. They would be standing up on the balcony and talking to each other while the other heads of state were talking business in a separate meeting room. They said this is a talk of socialists for the poor to take away from the rich, etc., etc., and essentially the Brandt summit or Cancun summit was a big failure. And that was, I think, a turning point in the North-South relations, because the North-South dialogue ended, in fact, and the North began its resistance to developing countries' demand and trying to block and neutralize developing countries' initiatives in the UN and elsewhere. This is why there was a pressure on the UNCTAD Secretariat not to help developing countries, and the targeting of individual developing countries with pressures and conditionalities to be less assertive in the international fora, using the debt relief and the related conditionalities for debt relief to pressure them into, I wouldn't say into submission, but into some kind of more obedient posture. And this eventually led to the situation in the 1980s, which was, I would say, composed of several distinct components. One was muzzling of UNCTAD and not allowing it anymore to help the Group of 77 and the non-aligned indirectly. The IMF pressure on developing countries with SAP's special adjustment packages, the World Bank becoming a global think tank on development and imposing the Washington Consensus on Development Dialogue, bypassing of the UN and using it for interventionism and control of the Global South through humanitarian intervention and human rights agenda, and the weakening of the Global South in the international fora on account of all these developments. I don't want to speak more about the past. What I would say now concerns the present, and I think what is important for the developing countries in the Global South is to try to revive and update the NEIO agenda, revive the lasting issues and needs of work, including for the new international information and communication order, which was also raised during the context of negotiations at that time, and rescue many of the items and issues which were simply shoved aside because of the resistance and negation by the conservative, basically, governments in the north. Because I should say that the accommodating and progressive leaders in the south virtually disappeared with the departure of Palme and Brandt from responsive posts in the north. Secondly, I think that the NEIO concept should be revived and brushed up and cleaned up for future and used, in fact, for building bridges between the north and the south. This is why the Progressive International's agenda and undertaking is so important and can be used, in fact, for bringing together progressive forces in the north and the south in the quest for progress on the international development and political agenda of the future. In this context, I want to flag the importance of the forthcoming summits of the non-aligned and of the Global South, which will take place in Kampala in December, I think, of 2023, which bring for the first time together the G77 and NAM, and will hopefully, how should I say, paste over this division between political and economic agendas because they go together. Which is obvious, and it was obvious during the NEIO episode that this is an important. In this context, there is also hope that there should be a hope that there will be a rise in the Global South of progressive, forward-looking leaders in high government posts, which at present are not too many. Not only there are not too many, but even those who might be interested, there's under so much pressure and so much interventionism from the north that they don't dare speak up and come forth. I think that COVID episode and now the Ukraine episode are two more impulses and reasons for the Global South to come forward, and also for the international community to revisit the former issues of the new international economic order and everything else that was done in the past, but was literally swept under the rug thanks to this, how shall I say, offensive or by the global north, which followed the Cancun summit, which needs to be reversed, and the south has to rise again and to assume a leading position and role in the global affairs, especially those that deal with all the key issues on the international agenda, which are not only economic, but also social and political. And I hope that the Progressive International will be able to help and to move the governments in this direction, and I hope that your meeting will be an input and a contribution in this direction. Thank you very much for asking me to make this statement. I should add that I'm not used to talking to the camera. I'm not used to look into the paper and read what I want to say, so I apologize for whatever omissions and hesitations I showed while I was talking. Thank you.
We are approaching the 50th anniversary of UN adopting the new International Economic Order resolution. The post-World War period saw the third world countries emerging from shackles of colonialism. And they understood that they were burdened with the underdevelopment of centuries of colonialism. Take my country for example. When the British came to the court of the Mughal Emperor in 1700, India accounted for 25% of the global production. When they departed from India in 1947, India's share in the global production was less than 5%. They developed, we underdeveloped. This is the situation of every third world country. Look at Africa. How did Africa, the cradle of civilization, became the dark continent? 0.1 billion humans were chained and taken to Americas as slaves. Why? Almost the entire human race in that continent was murdered, genocide, so that there was nobody to work with the plantations. It is from the base of this plunder the new capitalist system was constructed in the West. And therefore, with this bitter experience, when they gained independence, the third world countries, most of them decided to decouple with the West, decouple with the global system. And my best example is for India itself. We erected tariff barriers and decided to produce the goods and services that were being important during the colonial period by developing our agriculture, our industry. Since India couldn't plunder resources for accumulation from other countries like the West, they decided the government would have to play a very important role in mobilizing resources for development, planned development. So this was a system which enabled us to raise our rate of growth for one person, lower than the population growth in the colonial period, to 3.5 in the 3 decades of independence, and later 1980s into 5.5 and so on. Now this post-colonial period witnessed two sets of institutions. One was the UN system and its development agencies, the Trade Organization, UNESCO, Health Organization, Agriculture Organization, and so on, where everybody were equal, every country had one vote each. Other were the multilateral institutions of World Bank, IMF, GATT, and so on, where the principle was very different. The voting power was determined by your economic wealth and therefore effectively controlled by the developed countries. Now there is a kind of two sets of principles about vision about the future. One based upon so-called efficiency, which they thought would be ensured only under private proprietorship and total freedom to enterprise and so on, while the other UN system took into consideration the colonial past and the need for a world order which would provide equal or just opportunity for third world countries to come up. And these discussions, prompted by the non-aligned countries and supported by the Soviet bloc then, resulted finally in 1974 the resolution of new international economic order. But by 1980s and 1990s, the world changed totally in a direction, totally unexpected direction, into the very opposite of what was envisioned by new international economic order. There were many factors which were involved. One was the rise of finance capital in the all-powerful economic force, which brought the entire Latin America to submission, price open their economies, impose structural adjustment on them through IMF, and integrated them with the global economy. And with the collapse of the Soviet system, now there became a unipolar world with US dictating terms, and therefore you have a process of globalization under neoliberal terms. All these ideals of new international economic order were given up, and the new world system was enshrined in the conditions of WTO. WTO formation was not just a change the name from GATT to WTO. By bringing everything related to trade, investment, intellectual property rights, services, and so on into a single comprehensive trade treaty, now it was possible for the developed countries cross-retaliate if India infringes upon, say, the intellectual property right. Earlier, they could only repudiate Indian patent system, but now they can be retaliated in the trade, which is a pressure which India cannot stand. So the control of the imperialist countries became total. But meanwhile, two things became very evident, which made it clear the end of history hadn't occurred. One, this period was one of filthy inequality in every country and globally. Entire riches of the world being cornered by top 1%, both income and wealth. And poverty, that today there is enough wealth, technology, and knowledge to ensure that every human being in this globe has a decent life. But the system does not allow it. And then you had the financial crisis of 2008-9, which showed that the system is not able to resolve its internal contradictions. Second, it also became very clear the metabolic rift that Marx prophesied about a century back had become a reality, that climate change was challenging the continued existence of human race. But can the profit-motivated competitive system respond to this, not only social contradictions, but also contradiction between nature and society? Every day the world is slipping into a point of no return, and when the 27th summit has failed to produce a workable solution, a joint global action. Now, that the total bankruptcy of this global system was revealed in the COVID. Here is a major global challenge. No country in the world was safe. Nobody in the world was safe unless everybody became safe. But was it possible for the world to put up a common action against it? Why? Take the case of vaccine. WTO is yet to decide upon whether to give a waiver from the intellectual property rights enshrined in this treaty for the COVID vaccine. Or take the case of third world countries, particularly low developed countries. They were facing serious problems in the COVID period, economic problems. They didn't have the money to do their normal imports and so on. IMF, which normally turns Nelson's eye to these problems, and almost a Shylock in his character, even they were touched. They offered to create additional SDRs so that it could be shared with the developing countries also. It was vetoed. So this system cannot face this challenge, which has been shaking the whole globe in the last 2 years. And slowly the world is emerging from the COVID recession. But then the world is now slipping into a new recession. This time, actually being created by the world powers by hiking up the interest rate so they can control the inflation. The Volcker solution, once again resurrected after 3 decades. Why? Why should the world be now languishing in unemployment, poverty, and so on in this new round of recession? Why? Because the global system cannot find a solution to the Ukraine crisis. Somebody has to be taught a lesson. Therefore, a recession is more acceptable than a political solution. This is the system. Now, how do we respond to it? Certain good things are happening. One, people are increasingly becoming aware. That's the whole slogan of Tina is nonsense. There has got to be an alternative. Another world will be possible. The experience is taking them to that. Second, the unipolar world has changed. American domination continues, but it is being seriously challenged. In its own backyard, the Latin American countries, there is once again uptide of alternative quests that is taking place. You have Shanghai Economic Cooperation Organization. Like this, the challenge to the unipolar world is taking place. So this is the opportune moment to resurrect once again the idea of a new international economic order. Start discussing it. Now it cannot be just taken forward, copied from what was stated 50 years back. The world has changed. Therefore, we need a new vision that would suit the changed circumstances of a world order that gives justice not only to between human beings, but also between nature and humankind. How we will reach that order is a political process, which I don't think I would be able to contribute anything at this moment, but I am certain, let's put for the globe, once again, an alternative, a vision that gives hope. Thank you very much.
Let me thank the Progressive International for kindly inviting me to join you at the People's Forum in New York City on this occasion to mark and to think about the future of the new international economic order. In January 1974, the new international economic order was agreed to at the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, and it is very appropriate that almost half a century later, we begin to think about what we need to address the contemporary problems faced by the world. The initiative of the Progressive International is especially timely because the world faces a variety of issues, a variety of problems which demand urgent solutions. There are no easy solutions, undoubtedly, to these variety of problems, but it is important for us to begin to think very seriously about these issues in order to build a new international consensus to strengthen multilateralism and to ensure that developing countries, the once upon a time referred to as the third world and now increasingly referred to as the global south, can coalesce around these issues in order to reverse the process of steady deterioration and growing inequality in the world. In 1964, we find that it was a very important year where the group of 77 developing countries was first formed. And also later that year, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development was convened. These two developments in 1964 arguably led to the announcement and agreement, international consensus around the establishment of a new international economic order in 1974 by the United Nations General Assembly. Now, this followed, of course, a decade
of decolonization, especially in Africa, whereas Asia, much of Asia, which had been colonized, had successfully sought independence beginning from the 1940s through the 1950s and into the 1960s. It was a very tumultuous time. Independence was not ceded without bloodshed in some parts of the world, but there were many valiant struggles which were waged to achieve this. In 1971, President Richard Milhous Nixon brought an end to the Bretton Woods order, which had prevailed since 1944, and especially in the post-war world. The Bretton Woods order envisaged the establishment of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as it was initially termed, and thirdly, but not least, an international trade organization. The International Trade Organization was never formally launched because it was opposed by the US Congress. Nonetheless, the Bretton Woods system, as it was referred to, prevailed through the second half of the 1940s, through the 1950s and the 1960s, a period which some Keynesians and others refer to as a period of the golden age, where there was relatively high economic growth, especially after decolonization in developing countries, and also some degree of equity was achieved by addressing some of the greatest inequities of the colonial order. Now, the end of the Bretton Woods system basically gave rise to what many would term a non-system of a rule-less international monetary system, which one has to recognize prevails to this day. It gave rise during the 1970s to energy crisis as well as food security crisis. One very important feature of the Bretton Woods system, which was the insistence of national sovereignty over what is called the capital account. The capital account management has been enabled by Article 6 of the International Monetary Fund's Articles of Agreement, which prevail to this day. In other words, the International Monetary Order does exist in small parts and has been preserved through the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund. However, especially from the 1990s, we find that the Article 6 was no longer respected, and developing countries were basically urged by none other than the International Monetary Fund staff to give up their right to capital controls. This has created a range of problems, which we can discuss later. But I think it's important to recognize also that this situation, this non-system prevailing after 1971, gave rise to considerable inflation because of the considerable uncertainty about how international monetary issues were to be conducted. This brought an end to the age of the post-war golden age of growth, and gave rise to increasing inflation. And by the second half of the 1970s, a situation of stagflation emerged. In other words, of inflation coexisting with economic stagnation, a situation which was not envisaged by the Keynesian economics, which had been very influential up to that time. So since the 1970s, we find that economic growth has been slower, arguably except in parts of Asia, especially in East Asia. Now, all this is important for us to recognize because the situation has continued to prevail and in a sense threatens to return, has threatened to return in recent years. Now, Paul Volcker, the chairman of the United States Federal Reserve Bank, the Central Bank of the United States, emerged as a hero of Wall Street he raised interest rates. In fact, he raised interest rates so high that at one point they exceeded 20% very briefly in his attempts to bring down interest rates, to bring down inflation. He was so successful in bringing down inflation that he also managed to bring about stagnation in much of the world, especially in Latin America and Africa. This was less true of Asia, partly because Asia had not gone into as much debt as the other two continents of the global South. Now, it's important also to recognize that unlike the US Federal Reserve Bank, which has a dual mandate, most central banks in the world only focus on financial or price stability. In other words, they are mainly concerned with fighting inflation, or at least this is how they have interpreted the mandates in recent decades. The US Federal Reserve Bank not only seeks to preserve financial stability, but is also concerned with maintaining full employment. And this is a very important difference which developing countries should note, because developing country central banks should also have a strong commitment to enabling development. Now, the low inflation which central banks strive for seeks to preserve the value of financial assets, which has been especially significant in the contemporary age of financialization. So as financial interests have become increasingly dominant, especially in recent decades, we find that central bank policies are increasingly serving their interests. So central banks, although they are said to be independent, many central banks claim independence either legally or otherwise, but this independence is really not independence of the interests of financial markets. Rather, they tend to be subordinated to the interests of financial markets by seeking to preserve financial values. So financial asset values. And more recently, we find that there has been a commitment for over 3 decades now to achieving a 2% inflation target. This 2% inflation target has been completely arbitrarily arrived at. It was first introduced in the context of New Zealand on the whim of a finance minister who thought 2% sounded like a very good slogan going into elections. And this was transmitted to the central bank governor, who dutifully at that time went about preserving it. Why central banks in the rest of the world have adopted this 2% inflation target, which has got no theoretical or analytical basis, let alone a sound empirical basis, remains to be it's a question which remains to be asked of all central bank governors. It's also important to recognize that financialization has had many forms, and corporate financialization is also important for us. Thus, General Electric, which was once producing electrical consumer products, became a financial conglomerate with a particular focus on manufacturing assets. Similarly, Enron was once upon a time an energy company, and it became essentially a company which has sought to, which has basically also a financial conglomerate, but this time with an energy focus. All this kind of dominance by corporate interests, by financialized corporate interests, has led to the promotion of short-termism in much of the world. This kind of short-termism has exercised a very negative influence to the imperatives of development, and has basically caused a great number of problems to developing countries and aspirations for developing country growth. So developing countries are increasingly, as a consequence, very much beholden to short-term financial considerations rather than addressing the needs of their own governments. If I may move on now to considering some of the effects of financialization, it's important to recognize that, for instance, in the area of food security, an increasing number of commodities, including agricultural commodities, are deemed to be financial assets to be invested in, and there is a great deal of speculation and around them. And as a consequence of this, we find that the speculation has threatened food security and nutrition, and has done very little to, if anything, to address the limits to growth, which are now increasingly recognized, although it has been half a century since the original limits to growth arguments were first articulated by the Club of Rome. Similarly, we find that there are very important concerns about how this kind of financialization of agriculture has subverted efforts to promote agroecology, and very importantly as well, to try to achieve to make progress in the struggles against malnutrition, which do not just involve questions of insufficient carbohydrates, insufficient calories for working people, but also need to address other problems such as micronutrient deficiencies, vitamins and minerals, as well as food-related non. Now, another issue which has become, which has been increasingly recognized, is that the nature of government debt has changed very considerably. Increasingly, governments are not borrowing from other governments or from commercial banks. They're increasingly exploring and borrowing from other forms of market finance, many of which are subject to flexible interest rates. And all this basically has meant that government debt has, especially in developing countries, has become much more vulnerable to the vagaries of the market. So with the rising interest rates in the last year or so, we see that governments are straining to try to meet their debt obligations, which have become increasingly onerous in recent circumstances, especially with the pandemic and the disruptions, supply-side disruptions relating to the Ukraine war, as well as the sanctions which have been imposed as part of the Cold War. So what we need to begin to think about is how best to address some of these sovereign debt problems, which are increasingly challenging in the present situation, and how to limit and how to ensure that this leads to, for example, progressive climate action. And President Petro of Colombia, for example, has suggested that the possible exchange of debt for life. But unfortunately, I think there are very few prospects of such progress being made, given the lack of interest of the rich countries in making progress in this direction. Now, there has also been a great increased concern, once again, over state sovereignty over natural resources. These issues are still relevant today, although they were, until fairly recently, considered to be issues of the past. Yet another issue, of course, is the transfer of technology to developing countries in order for developing countries to be much more technologically viable and independent. But this has been greatly subverted by the TRIPS Amendment, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Amendment to the WTO Charter, introduced in 1995, which has greatly subverted the possibilities of technology transfer to developing countries and subjected them to so-called market considerations. Even the struggle, arguably the late President Nelson Mandela's last struggle to secure a public health exception to the TRIPS provisions were nominally agreed to in 2001 following the 9/11 tragedy. But as we have seen very recently, with the COVID-19 pandemic hitting so much of the world, there has been a complete reluctance on the part of the rich countries to allow a waiver to address the pandemic and to provide, for example, the production for the production of not only vaccines but also tests, treatments, as well as other kinds of requirements, personal protective equipment and other requirements demanded by the pandemic. This, of course, has been a major setback, which has been and the compromise which has been struck by at the World Trade Organization is not much of a compromise compared to the original South African and Indian proposal for a COVID-19 waiver, only for the duration of the pandemic. Now, we now face the prospect of trying to articulate and define a new international economic order for our times. Arguably, the old new international economic order proposal has largely failed. The commodity boom, as we know, ended after the 1970s. Inflation resulted in huge interest rate hikes, resulting in not only fiscal but also debt crisis. And we also know that the experience of structural adjustment programs in the decades since then have led to lost decades, not only in Latin America. Latin America, of course, lost much of the 1980s and arguably much of the 1990s as well. But Africa we saw an end to its growth from the end of the 1970s, and which lasted until the early part of this century. In other words, Africa lost almost a quarter of a century. We have seen, of course, a significant increase in globalization. And although many would argue that trade liberalization associated with globalization has largely come to an end since the agreement on the World Trade Organization, despite a number of other plurilateral free trade agreements, it is important to recognize that financial liberalization has continued largely unimpeded. And the consequence of this, of course, is the continued growth of inequalities, not only at the national level, which we are all quite cognizant of, but also at the international level, which gets very little attention. In fact, if you look at overall international income inequality, it is clear that international inequality accounts for about two-thirds of overall global inequalities compared to national inequalities, which only account for one-third. In other words, location, political geography counts much more than arguably class as in terms of explaining international inequalities. The end of the Cold War, First Cold War, saw the rise of U.S. sovereigntism as the U.S. appeared to triumph at the end of the Cold War. However, what we have also seen is an ideology associated with this so-called unipolar world, which has been increasingly belligerent. And meanwhile, we have seen the acceleration of global warming, the abandonment, the recent appeals to abandon the 1.5 degrees Celsius degree rise, which was originally agreed upon, and in the recent run-up to the Conference of Parties at Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, it's also important for us to note that climate finance is heavily biased towards mitigation, which, of course, the world will benefit from, with relatively few resources going to adaptation in developing countries, and almost nothing going for loss and damages, in other words, for climate reparations. This is a major problem, and although Sharm el-Sheikh saw the establishment of a new fund, it is not clear who is going to fill the fund. Now, let me try to turn finally to the question of the new international economic order and how one might think of a new international economic order in our times. We can, of course, begin to think about updating the original new international economic order elements and to try to revive that spirit. But I think it is incumbent upon all of us to think very seriously about addressing the problems for our times. And also, I would suggest that we need to begin to recognize that circumstances are changing all the time, and it is impossible to have sufficient foresight to anticipate all the challenges in the forthcoming future. And it's important for us to have a re-evaluation of the new international economic order demands on perhaps every decade rather than after half a century. So the recent pre-pandemic economic slowdowns, we have to recognize that the world economy was already slowing down very badly before the pandemic, and the final blow, of course, the coup de grace was provided by the pandemic. It's also important to recognize that the new Cold War has also seen increasingly economic dimension to it, which now threatens a new round of stagflation with continued inflation, because we find that most of the efforts to deal with inflation are only seek to raise interest and try to reduce demand, and very few address the supply side problems, which have been greatly exacerbated not only by the pandemic, but also by the economic Cold War, not only the war in Ukraine, but also the sanctions which are increasingly unilaterally imposed, not only on Russia, but a variety of other countries. Now, what we see now, of course, is a situation where we need to begin to think about some of the old commodity problems anew, and to begin to differentiate them in terms of the imperatives of achieving food security, but also greater security in terms of ensuring better nutrition. The struggle against malnutrition needs to be continued, and we need to recognize that the nature of contemporary government debt has changed very, very considerably. So we need to begin to think about what is appropriate for our times. And it's probably the case that we will need to think about the need for a new pacifist non-alignment. Pacifism is imperative now because it is the developing countries which are basically going to lose the most from a situation which where the the rich countries are the biggest powers in the world, are mainly preoccupied with waging struggles among themselves and not attempting to address the various problems which have been summed up, for example, by the United Nations in terms of the efforts to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. So pacifism should be a very important part of this new alignment. And my hope is that the idea of pacifism and a non-alignment is built into a conception of a new international economic order for our times. Thank you very much for your attention.
In name of the Progressive International and our hosts, the People's Forum, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I want to thank our distinguished guests who came here from across the world to contribute to this multilateral dialogue. I want to thank our friends and allies around the world who contributed virtually. I want to thank our interpreters who enabled us to have this bilingual transmission here today. And above all, I want to emphasize that this is the beginning and not the end of a process. Today, we have inaugurated a 2-year multilateral deliberation towards the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order. And I will see you all in Havana, Cuba, for our Congress on the NEIO next month. So thank you very much again, and see you in Cuba.